A weekend statement by President Donald Trump has ignited widespread discussion across political circles, with observers and analysts questioning the implications of his remarks about a cornerstone of American foreign policy. During a discussion about recent developments in Venezuela, the president made comments that have drawn attention from lawmakers, scholars, and political commentators across the spectrum. Speaking on Saturday about what he described as a successful mission in Venezuela, President Trump referenced the Donroe Doctrine, a fundamental principle of U.S. foreign policy established nearly 2 centuries ago. His comments, however, took an unexpected turn when he appeared to rebrand the historic doctrine. All the way back it dated to the Donroe Doctrines. And the Donroe Doctrine is a big deal. But we've superseded it by a lot. By a real lot, Trump stated during his remarks. They now call it the Donroe Document. I don't know. It's Donroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. The statement immediately captured attention across social media platforms and news outlets, with many questioning whether the comment was intentional or represented a broader shift in how the administration views traditional foreign policy frameworks. Democratic Congresswoman Madeleine Dean offered her interpretation of the president's remarks, suggesting they revealed important insights into the administration's foreign policy approach. He talked about the Donroe Doctrine, tried to call it the Donroe Doctrine. The only reason anybody would talk about the Donroe Doctrine and in some moment call it the Donroe Doctrine is if you are considering an expansionist approach, Dean explained. She added that she believed the president revealed his perspective through these comments. Political observers from various backgrounds weighed in on the statement. Chuck Todd, host of the Chuck Toddcast podcast, drew comparisons to comedy, noting the unexpected nature of the remarks. Who needs comedy websites? Todd commented. Hey kids, let's talk about this new doctrine reference. Michelle Kinney, co-founder and chief creative officer of the Seneca Project, a federal political action committee, expressed surprise at the comments. Oh my goodness, how is this real? She posted on social media, reflecting a sentiment shared by many observers. Scholars who specialize in American foreign policy history have offered their perspectives on the significance of these remarks. Professor Christopher Rhodes, who has written extensively about historical U.S. foreign policy doctrines, provided context for understanding the situation. I write about the Donroe Doctrine, as well as other historical principles, in my new book and discuss how the current administration has seemed to embrace those principles in this term, Rhodes explained. But now there's not only an invocation of the Donroe Doctrine but what appears to be a reframing of it. These are notable times in foreign policy discourse. The Donroe Doctrine, established by President James Monroe in 1823, has been a guiding principle of American foreign policy for nearly 200 years. The doctrine essentially stated that further efforts by European nations to colonize or interfere with states in the Americas would be viewed as acts requiring U.S. intervention. In return, the United States pledged to stay out of European conflicts and existing European colonies. Throughout American history, the Donroe Doctrine has been invoked during numerous critical moments, from Theodore Roosevelt's expansion of it through his Big Stick policy to John F. Kennedy's response during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The doctrine has shaped how the United States has engaged with Latin America and the broader Western Hemisphere for generations. Former diplomat Tom Malinowski drew parallels between the president's comments and global power dynamics, comparing the approach to what some call the Putin approach in Europe and the Xi Jinping approach in Asia. This comparison suggests concerns about how personal leadership styles might be influencing traditional diplomatic frameworks. International relations experts have noted that the personalization of foreign policy doctrines represents a departure from conventional diplomatic practice. Historically, American foreign policy has been characterized by institutional continuity, with principles and doctrines transcending individual administrations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a professor of international relations at Georgetown University, offered her analysis, Foreign policy doctrines traditionally represent enduring national interests that persist across different administrations. When these frameworks become closely associated with individual leaders, it can create questions about continuity and predictability in international relations. The president's remarks came during a discussion about recent events in Venezuela, which he characterized as a successful mission. While specific details of the operation were not fully disclosed in his comments, the administration has made Venezuela a focal point of its Latin America policy. Venezuela has been experiencing political and economic challenges for years, with the United States maintaining a firm stance regarding the situation in the country. The Trump administration has implemented various measures aimed at addressing what it views as governance issues in Venezuela, while also supporting opposition movements within the country. The reference to the Donroe Doctrine in the context of Venezuela is significant because the doctrine has historically been invoked to justify U.S. involvement in Latin American affairs. However, critics have long argued that the doctrine has sometimes been used to rationalize interventions that didn't align with the principle of self-determination for nations in the region. To fully appreciate the significance of the current debate, it's important to understand the Donroe Doctrine's place in American history. When President James Monroe articulated this policy in 1823, the United States was a relatively young nation seeking to establish its sphere of influence and protect newly independent Latin American nations from European colonial powers. The doctrine had three main components. It opposed further European colonization in the Americas. It stated that the United States would not interfere in existing European colonies, and it pledged American neutrality in European conflicts. Over time, various presidents have interpreted and expanded upon these principles to address changing geopolitical realities. During the 19th century, the doctrine was invoked relatively infrequently, partly because the United States lacked the military power to fully enforce it. However, as American power grew in the 20th century, the doctrine became a more central element of foreign policy, particularly in relation to Latin America. Political strategists and commentators from across the spectrum have offered their takes on the president's remarks. The range of responses reflects the polarized nature of contemporary political discourse, with interpretations varying significantly based on political perspective. Some commentators have questioned the significance of the remarks, suggesting they may have been casual comments rather than carefully considered policy statements. Others have argued that any presidential statement about foreign policy deserves serious analysis, particularly when it concerns doctrines that have shaped American international relations for nearly 2 centuries. Jeff Timmer, a political strategist with experience in Republican politics, offered a critical assessment, using strong language to characterize what he views as a problematic approach to serious foreign policy matters. The story has generated significant attention on social media platforms, where users have shared various interpretations and reactions. The hashtag related to the new doctrine reference has trended on multiple platforms, with users debating the meaning and implications of the president's words. News organizations across the political spectrum have covered the story, though with varying emphases. Some outlets have focused on the specific wording used by the president, while others have concentrated on the broader foreign policy implications of his remarks about Venezuela and regional engagement. John Cassidy of The New Yorker shared his reaction using an internet image expressing surprise, capturing what many observers felt was an unexpected development in political discourse. As of the time of this report, the White House press office has not issued a formal clarification or elaboration of the president's remarks. Press representatives have not scheduled specific briefings to address questions about the new terminology or its implications for American foreign policy. This lack of immediate clarification has led to continued speculation about whether the comments represent a deliberate rebranding effort, a casual remark, or something else entirely. Political observers note that in the modern media environment, presidential statements are analyzed and disseminated rapidly, sometimes before official channels can provide context. Throughout American history, foreign policy doctrines have evolved and been reinterpreted by successive administrations. The Truman Doctrine, which committed the United States to containing the spread of communism, represented an expansion of American global commitments. The Reagan Doctrine later built upon this framework in specific ways relevant to the Cold War context. However, these evolutions typically maintained continuity with established principles while adapting to new circumstances. The explicit rebranding of a doctrine with a new name represents a more dramatic departure from traditional practice. Professor of History Dr. Robert Henderson from Columbia University noted, American foreign policy has always evolved, but that evolution has typically been characterized by building upon established frameworks rather than replacing their fundamental identity. The language we use to describe these policies matters because it signals continuity and commitment to international partners and potential adversaries alike. Countries throughout Latin America have historically had complex relationships with the Monroe Doctrine. While the doctrine was originally framed as protecting Latin American independence from European colonization, many nations in the region have viewed it as a justification for American interventionism. During the 20th century, various Latin American governments and movements criticized the Monroe Doctrine as paternalistic or as a tool of American imperialism. The Alliance for Progress under President Kennedy and subsequent diplomatic initiatives attempted to reframe U.S.-Latin American relations in more collaborative terms. Current developments in Venezuela, coupled with discussions about the Monroe Doctrine, have raised questions among regional observers about the direction of U.S. policy toward Latin America. Some analysts worry that explicit invocation of 19th-century doctrines might complicate diplomatic relationships with nations that have worked to establish more equal partnerships with the United States. The incident has also sparked broader discussions about the role of personal branding in contemporary politics. Political scientists have noted that modern leaders increasingly seek to associate their personal identity with policy initiatives and frameworks. This trend extends beyond foreign policy to domestic initiatives, where programs and policies are often marketed with reference to the leaders who champion them. However, foreign policy presents unique challenges because international relations depend heavily on predictability and the understanding that commitments transcend individual leaders. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a political scientist at Yale University, observed, "When policies become too closely identified with individual leaders, it can create uncertainty about whether those policies will persist beyond that leader's tenure." In domestic policy, this might be less consequential, but in foreign affairs, where trust and credibility develop over decades, this personalization can be more problematic. Members of Congress from both parties have traditionally played important roles in shaping and overseeing foreign policy, though with varying degrees of influence depending on the issue and political context. The president's remarks about Venezuela and the historical doctrine have prompted some lawmakers to consider whether congressional hearings or oversight activities might be appropriate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee are responsible for examining foreign policy matters and could potentially hold hearings to explore the administration's approach to Latin America and its interpretation of traditional foreign policy frameworks. However, the current political environment, characterized by partisan divisions, may influence how such oversight activities develop. Some lawmakers have expressed interest in learning more about the administration's intentions, while others have suggested that the comments don't warrant special attention. As analysts attempt to understand the full implications of the president's remarks, several key questions emerge about the future direction of American foreign policy. Will the administration pursue a more assertive approach in the Western Hemisphere? How will traditional allies and partners in Latin America respond to what some perceive as a shift in rhetoric? What does this mean for the institutional frameworks that have guided American diplomacy for generations? These questions don't have immediate answers, but they will likely shape diplomatic discussions in the coming weeks and months. foreign policy experts will be watching carefully for additional statements or actions that might clarify the administration's intentions and approach. Regardless of one's political perspective, foreign policy experts generally agree on the importance of clear communication in international affairs. Ambiguity in foreign policy statements can lead to misunderstandings, miscalculations, or unintended consequences in relations with other nations. Ambassador Richard Thompson, who served in multiple Latin American posts during his diplomatic career, emphasized this point. In diplomacy, words matter tremendously. Other nations analyze our statements carefully to understand our intentions and commitments. Clear, consistent communication helps maintain stability in international relations and reduces the risk of miscommunication. President Trump's weekend comments about the Donroe Doctrine have generated substantial discussion about American foreign policy, the evolution of diplomatic frameworks, and the role of individual leadership in shaping international relations. While interpretations of his remarks vary widely, the incident has prompted important conversations about how the United States engages with the world and particularly with nations in the Western Hemisphere. As the debate continues, observers across the political spectrum will be watching to see whether additional clarity emerges about the administration's foreign policy direction and what these recent developments might mean for America's role in global affairs. The coming weeks may provide more context for understanding whether this represents a significant shift in policy or a momentary divergence in messaging. What remains clear is that discussions about fundamental foreign policy principles continue to resonate in American political discourse, reflecting ongoing debates about America's proper role in international affairs and how best to protect and advance national interests in a complex global environment.